It's late. The world outside has gone quiet, and you're lying there somewhere between awake and somewhere else entirely. Your eyes are closed, or almost closed, and in that strange space between thinking and dreaming, a question appears. Not a loud question, not an urgent one, just a quiet thought drifting through the dark. What if everything I know about the past is only a version of it? Not a lie, not a fabrication, just one interpretation, one perspective, one story told by certain voices in a certain language from a certain point in time. And the rest, the parts that didn't make it into the books you were handed, are still out there, waiting. And the silence between facts, and the dust of places no one visits anymore, and the questions that were never asked loudly enough to get an answer. Tonight, we're not going to rush. We're not going anywhere urgent. We're just going to drift through some of the quieter corners of human history. The parts that make you wonder. The parts that don't close neatly. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften. And just listen. When you were young, history was presented to you as something solid. Dates, names, events. A sequence that moved in one direction, forward, from primitive to advanced, from darkness to understanding, from then to now. And it felt settled. Like the answers were already in. Like the story had been told and all that remained was to memorize it. But here is something worth sitting with tonight. History is not a recording, it is a retelling. And every retelling involves a choice. What to include, what to emphasize, what to move past quickly, and what to leave in the silence entirely. The ancient Greeks called this historia, which simply meant inquiry, an investigation, not a conclusion, an ongoing act of asking. Somewhere along the way, the inquiry became a curriculum. The questions became answers, and the answers became walls. Tonight, we're going to lean back against those walls and notice where they feel a little hollow. Not with suspicion, not with anger. With the quiet, open curiosity of someone lying in the dark, with nowhere to be and nothing to prove, Consider for a moment how a story survives. A thing happens. Someone witnesses it. They describe it to someone else. That person records it in their own language, through their own understanding, with their own reasons for writing it down. Centuries pass. The record is copied, translated, interpreted, placed inside a larger narrative that makes sense to the people doing the placing. And eventually it arrives in a classroom, on a page, in the mind of someone who has no reason to question it, because it arrived with the quiet authority of the already known. The Library of Alexandria. You've heard of it, a place of extraordinary accumulated knowledge in the ancient world. Scrolls containing mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, history, centuries of human inquiry gathered in one place, and then gone, not all at once, not in one dramatic fire, the way the story is sometimes told, but gradually, over decades, through neglect, through conflict, through the slow erosion of the institution that housed it. What was lost, we cannot fully know, because when knowledge disappears, it takes the record of its own existence with it. We don't know what we no longer know. That sentence is worth staying with for a moment. We don't know what we no longer know. The gaps in human understanding are invisible, not because they're hidden, but because we have nothing left to point at them. And if an entire library of ancient knowledge could quietly cease to exist, what else has slipped away? What questions were being asked 3,000 years ago that we've since stopped asking? Not because they were answered, but because the thread was simply lost. The truth, it seems, is more fragile than we like to believe, not because people are careless, but because time is patient, and time does not preserve everything equally. There are places on this earth that were once full of people, full of language and ritual, and the ordinary texture of daily life. Children growing up, elders passing knowledge down, builders laying stones in patterns that meant something to them. And now silence, the Indus Valley civilization. Around 2500 BCE, roughly the same time the pyramids of Egypt were being built on the other side of the world, a sophisticated urban culture flourished across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Cities with advanced drainage systems, grid-planned streets, standardized weights and measures suggesting complex trade, a script that we still cannot read. And then, somewhere around 1900 BCE, the cities were gradually abandoned, the people dispersed, the civilization dissolved back into the landscape, not in a sudden collapse, in a slow, quiet fading. We don't know exactly why. Climate shifts, perhaps, changes in the river systems that sustain them, or something else entirely, something that left no record we've been able to decipher. They had a written language, they carved it into seals and tablets, and we have found those artifacts. We hold them in our hands, we look at the symbols, and we cannot hear what they're saying. Imagine that, an entire civilization, its stories, its laws, its prayers, its arguments, encoded in a language that has been sitting in museum collections for 100 years and remains, in the most precise sense of the word, silent. Or consider the people of Easter Island, a small, impossibly remote piece of land in the South Pacific, where at some point in history, a culture developed that moved enormous stone figures across the landscape, nearly 900 of them, some weighing over 80 tons, moved somehow without the wheel, without metal tools, without draft animals. The island's own oral traditions speak of the statues walking, of ancestors made tangible in stone, of a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than we tend to imagine. We study the stones, we run computer models, we debate the mechanisms, but the inner life of the people who made them, what they believed, what they feared, what they celebrated in the moment a statue was finally raised, that we will never fully know. And there is something quietly beautiful about that. The mystery doesn't have to be solved to be meaningful. Some things were not preserved, so that we might be reminded that not everything can be. History is hinge points, moments so small, so contingent on chance, that the mind resists believing they determine so much. In 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned from a holiday to find that a petri dish he had left out had grown a mold. The mold, Penicillium notatum, had killed the bacteria around it. Fleming noticed. He was curious. He investigated, and from that small act of noticing, an antibiotic was eventually developed that is estimated to have saved over 200 million lives. He almost didn't leave the dish out. He almost cleaned it before he left. The window of his laboratory happened to face in a direction that provided the precise conditions the mold needed. A dozen small accidents conspired to produce one of the most consequential medical discoveries in human history. Or consider the night of June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria has already survived one assassination attempt that morning in Sarajevo. His motorcade takes a wrong turn. His driver, realizing the mistake, stops the car to reverse, directly in front of a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, who had already given up on the day, who was standing in front of a delicatessen. Processing his failure, the car stops. Princip fires. And the chain of events that follows, through alliances and ultimatums and mobilizations, produces the First World War, which produces the conditions for the Second, which produces the atomic age, which produces the world you are lying in right now. A wrong turn, a stopped car, a young man who hadn't yet walked away. We tell history as if it moved by logic, by the pressure of large forces, economics, ideology, geography, and those forces are real, but underneath them, there is always the moment, the specific, unrepeatable, almost accidental moment, where one small thing went one way instead of another, and everything followed from that. There are ways of understanding the world that existed for centuries and then simply ceased to be the dominant way, not because they were proven wrong, sometimes just because something else became more convenient, more useful to the structures of the time. For thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, time was not understood as linear. It was understood as cyclical. The ancient Hindus described vast cycles of cosmic time, yugas spanning millions of years, periods of expansion and contraction, of clarity and forgetting, of civilizations rising, reaching their peak and slowly descending, not as failure, but as part of a larger rhythm, the way a breath rises and falls, the way seasons return. The ancient Greeks had a similar concept. The Stoics spoke of ekpyrosis, the periodic dissolution of the world into fire, and its subsequent renewal, not as catastrophe, as cycle. We don't think this way anymore. We think in straight lines, progress moving always forward, history as an arrow pointed toward an ever-improving future. But that idea, The linear idea is itself relatively recent, a few hundred years old in a species that has been asking questions for tens of thousands. What did the world feel like when you understood yourself to be inside a cycle rather than on a line? When the fall of great things was not a tragedy to be prevented, but a natural movement to be understood? When the past was not something you'd escaped, but something you were always in some sense returning to? We may never know how that felt from the inside, but lying in the dark with the world quiet around you, you can almost sense the edge of it. We believe we are the most advanced humans who have ever lived, and in certain measurable ways, we are medicine, technology, communication, lifespan. The numbers support the story. But there are other measures. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote about the dangers of distraction, about the way a life can pass in noise and busyness without ever being truly examined. He wrote this 2,000 years ago in a letter to a friend, about the difficulty of finding silence in a city, about how the mind left unguarded is pulled in 100 directions at once. You could read that letter today and feel that it was written last week. The Greek philosopher Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, observed that human nature remains constant across time, that the same fears, the same ambitions, the same patterns of conflict repeat. Not because humans are doomed, but because the fundamental nature of the creature asking the questions hasn't changed as much as the creature likes to believe. Every generation believes it has finally understood something the previous generations missed. Every generation looks back at the past with a kind of gentle condescension. They didn't know what we know now, and they were right, of course, and also not entirely. Because the people in the past who we study and reconstruct, and sometimes pity, were asking the same questions you are asking tonight. Who am I? What does any of this mean? Is there a pattern beneath all of this movement? And does the pattern include me? They didn't know what would come after them. Neither do you. That is not a frightening thought. That is the most honest thought available to any human being in any century. Though, of course, history doesn't end. It continues just past where the light reaches. What you know about the past is real, and it is partial. Both things are true at once. The dates, the names, the events, they happened, and they were experienced by people who felt the ordinary weight of being alive. In a moment they didn't yet know was historical, who didn't know they would be remembered or forgotten, or that someone, thousands of years later, would be lying in the dark, wondering about them. The library burned or faded, or was slowly dismantled. The Indus script remains unread. The stone figures of Easter Island stand in silence. Gavrilo Princip stood in front of a delicatessen, and Seneca wrote about distraction 2,000 years before the notifications began. History is not a solved equation. It is an ongoing question, asked by each generation in the particular dark of their particular moment. You are part of that, not outside it looking in, inside it, moving through it, leaving without knowing it the traces that some future person will one day try to piece together. So let the questions rest tonight, not because they aren't worth asking, but because some questions are better held than answered, better carried than resolved. Let your breathing slow. Let the ancient ruins settle into the dark behind your eyes. Let the stars that ancient people also looked up at do their quiet, patient work above you. You don't need to figure it out tonight. Nobody ever has. And somehow the world kept going anyway.